All right, so we're going to move on now to the next session that will be chaired by Stanley Mirvis, and it's going to focus on Jews and the history of pandemics. In a sense, we already touched on the historical dimension, but now we have 4 presentations more specific. So Mirvis, Stanley, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Chava. And to all of the participants here, these have been really wonderful papers, and especially to those of you coming from Israel or other places where I know it's getting pretty late. Apropos that, our first speaker in our session on Jews and history of pandemics is going to be Professor David Passig, who is a futurist, a lecturer, a consultant, and best-selling author who specializes in technological, social, and educational futures. Professor Passig is an associate professor at Bar-Ilan University in Ramat Gan in Israel, where he teaches at the Graduate School of Education, and he runs Bar-Ilan's graduate program in communication technologies, as well as their virtual reality laboratory. He is the chair of Future Code, which is a limited company, which develops and employs toolkits of computerized futures, methods, and decision-making processes. He's also co-founder and chief evangelist of Thinks Ltd, which develops social platforms. He is on consulting all over the world and has served as the chief advisor to the Commissioner for Future Generations in the Israeli Knesset. He is a member of the Israeli National Council for Research and Development, and Professor Passig's best-selling books include The Future Code, 2048, For Cognito, The Future Mind, and The Fifth Fiasco, How to Escape the Traps of Jewish History in 21st Century. And for each of those books, he has received one of Israel's Gold Book Awards. So we're really fortunate to have him here. And please, Professor Passig. I think you're muted.
Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we see your presentation and we can hear you.
All right, thank you very much. So what I would like to do is to try and answer the following 2 questions, which are not so easy to do at this very early stage of such a pandemic, but I'll try to do it as much as I can. The first one is to a little bit define better what we call the dynamics behind pandemics during history. And then I will try to see, based on that, that understanding of the dynamics, try to see the long-term implications of this very specific pandemic. So just to remind all of us, we have been in competition with the viruses for forever. As far as we know, it has been coming again and again, every epoch, sometimes every decade, sometimes every century, but it has caused so much damage that we tend to just put it in our subconsciousness until the next time it comes. By the way, we are still on another pandemic, which is the HIV pandemic. As far as we know, there were already some 40 million casualties from that pandemic. And of course, we are now on this recent one. If I am to sum up the driving force, not the causes of pandemics, but the dynamics behind the causes of pandemics, I would just, summarize it in as simple as possible as follows. Humanity, this species has done something unusual in evolution, which is the domestication of animals. Now, if you take that phenomena of domestication further in time, we were able, because of that, the domestication, to develop new ways of transportation. The moment we started really developing faster ways of transportation, we started communicating with each other. And in order really to trade with each other, we have developed what we call currencies or money. The outcome of that very long process is what we call nowadays urbanization. And of course, in the last 300-400 years, what we call industrialization, and recently globalization. And the outcome of all of these are what we call now the mega cities in which we are all living. The mega cities are probably the most important thing that humanity has done during millennia, and the outcome of that phenomena is, of course, a lot of very positive things, but the outcome of that phenomena is also what we call pandemics. So we went from, skin shelters to high-rise all over the world. By the way, I'm at this very moment just at that spot that you see over there, and over here, if you don't see it. And I'm on Roosevelt Island and part of on a sabbatical on Cornell Tech. Anyway, if we are just to take a very large look at some of the plagues that devastated humanity, you can see that the percentage of death from the people that were infected is really going up and down, and there are reasons for that. But I would like just you to remember the numbers, because we are really in something that is much greater than we can understand at this point in time. So if you take a look at the bubonic plague, 95% of people that were infected actually died at the end, and it was devastating. It actually killed about a quarter of world population. The Black Plague, that's everybody is speaking about as the most devastating thing, it was not exactly the most devastating thing as far as we know. Again, it killed only a third of humanity, but it started, we probably don't know the plagues and the pandemics that were not recorded during millennia before that. And there are some studies that are speaking that humanity almost, this Homo sapiens, as much as we know this species, about 60,000 years ago, almost vanished. There were left only something like 10,000 people on Earth about 60,000 years ago. And one of the reasons, of course, is great pandemics that used to occur time after time. We are now here in the early years of the third decade of the 21st century. And if you see, we are already reaching 6.1 million people that died from this pandemic. As far as I found a few days ago, we are at the rate of about 4 million more people that are going to die in this coming year, in 2022. And probably these numbers are just the very lowest estimates that at the end we will have on our hands. There is a phenomena very known that most of the time we double the numbers that are formally published. At this time, there are a lot of studies that are saying that are, even having some indications that we will have to quadruple the numbers that we will have at hand at the end, of course, of this pandemic. Now, we reached a point in which really our civilization is very urban, and we are so packed together that probably it's not going to end with this pandemic, and we are going to see new pandemics that will occur every decade or a couple decades in the future, unless we are going to change totally our civilization. At least we know that our urban life or lifestyle as we know it now started something like, the big fire that London experienced in the 17th century. And it is clear that the more humans have suffered from great disasters, they were always, trying to figure out the reasons, trying to develop and invent new tools in order to take its civilization to a new level of course, organization and better life for everyone. If I am to sum up the most important things that humanity has developed that brought us into this very current level of urbanization, I'll try to do it in a very simple way in order to try to understand how it's going to affect the future of civilization in the 21st century. So the first invention that really started what we call now cities is when Romans in Pompeii invented the sheets of glass, and the idea was to protect from wind and rain, and of course it helped light penetrate into those dark enclaves that humans used to live in. If you add to that glass some cement and some iron, and we are at the beginning of what we call cities. The chimney was the second invention, and that was something unusual because that helped ventilate the smoke of those small living rooms in which we used to live, to sleep, to eat all together. Of course, the most important thing of that invention is that it has pushed, that was the driving force of what we call nowadays privacy. And since then, people started providing different kinds of rooms until we reached just, a couple centuries ago, the ability to build, buildings that are 6 or at most 7 floors. And the idea was people didn't want to take stairs more than 6 or 7 floors. The third invention, which was really crucial in our urbanization civilization, is the elevator's safety brake. And that convinced people that they can safely, rise more than those 6, 7 floors. The end of it, of course, is crucial because that the combination of chimney with elevators caused architects to develop different or a few rooms on each place or each, let's say, bubble of residency, and that pushed humanity to start developing values like modesty, like social classes, because everybody wanted to do it in a different way. Of course, it differentiated between lifestyles, different places, different nations, different cultures, developed new kinds of those small spaces. And of course, the most important thing is that when privacy has developed, then each one started generating new and unique ideas that continued pushing our society and our civilization further. And that brings me to the current mega fire that probably is going to change urban civilization. It will take some time, but probably we have just started a new phase in our development, at least in our lifestyle, in our way of living and working, etc., etc. What you see here is the bloom of the COVID-19 virus under the electron microscope, and some of the researchers are speaking that it is much worse than the fire that consumed 4/5 of London. It is the main cause that it has happened is because we are so packed, and we are so packed really in manners that we have to develop new things in order to continue our civilization. The idea is that there is now some debate, what is the next invention that is going to push forward our civilization? And some of us are speaking about, of course, the drones that are going to enable everybody to stay in their bubbles, work, eat, and of course, exchange ideas. And from time to time, we will have just, to face each other. But if this is really going to happen, because not just the COVID-19, but because of what we expect is going still to happen in the next decade or two, then it's probably going to have a great effect. So if we are to sum up what we have went through, we went through the prairie dwelling to caves to villages to mega cities. At this very moment on Earth, humanity is condensed something like a little bit more than 50%, 56% of humanity is condensed on cities. By 2050, we are speaking about 70% of humanity that is going to be condensed in cities. And this is really a landmark in human evolution. And we are trying to understand not the very long term of this trend, but at least the near future, if you wish. For us, near future means something like 30, 50 years ahead. And this is what I'm going to try to do. It is clear that cities have been developing in the last 300 years, as we see here, have almost reached their peak of efficiency, and decay is becoming more and more relevant in whatever we are watching. And probably in 200 years from now or 300 years from now, we will have to develop very different kind of urban lives. I'm just giving you, some ideas that are being published in different venues, trying to understand better how lifestyle of the future is going to develop, how we are going to be organized, what kind of work we are going to be able to work in environments that are much more packed with people. Okay, so we are trying to do it, and I'm going to share with you one study that I'm a part of. It's a study that is using a methodology called Delphi. It's a variation of Delphi. You are probably aware of that methodology. And the idea is to take a group of experts from different perspectives. All of them, of course, are future oriented in their expertise, and try to see if a group of people will accept or agree upon what might happen in the next 30 to 50 years. The person that is running this study and leading us is Professor Ilan from George Washington University. But I'm giving you here just a very short list of the people that are part of this study. We are constantly working on publishing some papers about the outcome of these conversations. And by the way, if you are not familiar with the idea of Delphi, the most important characteristic of this methodology is that all the discussions are anonymous, so that nobody will have a great impact because of its stature, etc. So what we have found is the following. We've found that probably we are at the verge of a new consciousness that humanity is going to start experiencing and, of course, exercising in many ways. Okay, so I'm going to try and explain it through quantum physics very known phenomena, which is called entanglement. What we have found in quantum physics is that, for example, two photons can be linked in space, even if you wish, through galaxies. And if you act on one of these particles, the other particle is acting or behaving the same way as the particle that is nearby and you are trying to somehow influence. So I'm taking the idea of entanglement, and what we're speaking about is that probably this crisis, this pandemic, which is really global, that in a matter of a couple months, there was no single place on earth that was not infected. This pandemic is going to push forward something that has already happened, that has already begun to happen, but it's going to take a different and a much evolved stage in which we will understand better how entangled humans are with, not just with each other, but with its environment, with the animals that are around him, with almost everything that engulfs human beings. So I'm going to pick up some of what of us were speaking about, just to give you some sense of this entangled consciousness that we are speaking about. Okay, for example, Professor Neatula is the chair of the future studies in UNESCO. He says the following. He says that as you know, we all know that communism has collapsed during the early years of the 90s. And a lot of people are trying to understand what really happened that communism collapsed in such a manner. Nobody expected a collapse that, as we have seen it, in a matter of really a year or a couple of years. Everybody was thinking that it will take it at least a decade. So one of the reasons that most of the experts agree upon that was the reason, at least, behind the collapse of communism, was that they didn't understand really the information age. They didn't understand. They couldn't adjust to the idea that information is flowing in a very different way than it used to be when they, established the ideology of communism. And this is one of the reasons that it has collapsed. And what Suhail is trying to anticipate is actually believes very much that even capitalism is now at the same verge of crisis. And the reason is that he's saying capitalism really doesn't understand the whole meaning, the whole impact of automated knowledge. And one of the outcomes of that phenomena is, of course, what we all call fake news, etc., etc. And he says that in a matter of probably a decade or so, there will be so many outcomes to those to that phenomena that it will bring to its knees the ideology, the infrastructures, of course, the financial infrastructures of what we call nowadays capitalism. If I will introduce you to someone else, Professor Fletcher from New Zealand, she is a very interesting political scientist that is constantly researching, studying how challenging epochs in history has caused not just turmoil, and how those challenging epochs have developed, has pushed humanity to reorganize itself politically, economically, etc., etc. So what she's saying is that this pandemic also is going to act as it has acted for millennia on human civilization. And the basic thing that is happening most of the time is that the most acknowledged people and movers in science, in politics, in economy, most of the time they are losing their authority, and the fringe of ideas are becoming are coming into the forefront of the mainstream platforms, thinkers, etc., etc. And those fringe ideas, humanity is trying to figure out what might help its civilization to, first of all, overcome the crisis, and then not just overcome the crisis, but continue and go to a higher level, if you wish, of its development and evolution. That's Amy. What I have contributed to this group is the following. I said probably we're going to see two stages, two phases to the crisis that is going to be part of humanity in the next at least 30 years. I agreed that the current globalization paradigm, I'm not speaking about capitalism like Suhail, I'm speaking about the globalization paradigm, is going to be very much challenged because of this crisis. And there are a lot of reasons. Unfortunately, I don't have time to elaborate on them, but we all feel that something is really happening to globalization. Specifically, by the way, after what we are seeing now with Russia and Ukraine, but it's only at the beginning of something much bigger that is happening in all fronts, almost from from security level, geopolitical, political issues, economic issues. Everything is being shaken by part of it, of course, this pandemic. And what I'm saying is that the flow of the current globalization paradigm is since the most important tenet of that paradigm of what we call the mutual cooperation is based only on voluntary interest. The more I think, or a nation thinks that global affairs are for their favors, for their interest, then they are willing to be part of larger groups. The moment they see that their interest is not exactly aligned with the common interest, then they are retreating. And we are seeing it almost in Brexit. We are seeing it in economic issues. We're seeing it even in this very specific pandemic, when Trump retreated from very important institutes that were supposed to help humanity not reach the level of pandemic that we have experienced. So this is the first stage of challenge that humanity is going to experience in the next decade or two. The next phase of this
we have
phenomenon,
about 5 minutes left. I'm sorry.
I'm about to finish in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. And the second stage of this development is probably a new kind of paradigm of cooperation that is going to emerge from the collapse of the current globalization paradigm. And the idea is that we will start developing institutes where we will start. It's exactly what happened after the Spanish flu. We have started organizing ourselves with new institutes, global institutes, services, health services that will help help us not slide again to a devastating pandemic. So with the same thing, we're going to start generating ideas and the paradigms of new institutes that are more geared towards experiencing or actualizing or realizing the idea behind the symbiosis or the inextricable ties that we are going to bit by bit with great difficulties, with a lot of political clashes between groups. We are bit by bit, we're going to develop new mechanisms that will establish that interdependency, that the consciousness we are speaking about will be realized. It will take humanity another century or two to fully mature that kind of consciousness, but we probably have started that development. And as it has happened always in evolution, those kind of crises are only a springboard that push human civilization to higher levels. I believe that that's all what I have to say. If I had to have time, I would go and explain how it's going to change our corporate values and a lot of other aspects of our dealings with each other. But I believe that my time is over, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to share some ideas. Unfortunately, and I'm sorry about that, I won't be able to stay for the Q&A, but if you have any question, please send me an email. I'll be very glad to answer as much as possible. I didn't take into account the exact hours between us, and I'm sorry about that. And thank you for the opportunity to switch the slot with I don't remember the name of the person who was supposed to be the first in this session. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Passig. That gives us a lot to think about for the future. Our next speaker is my friend Joshua Teplitsky, who's an associate professor in the Department of History at Stony Brook, where he researches and teaches about Jewish life in Central Europe in the early modern period. He has held fellowships at the University of Oxford, the National Library of Israel, the University of Pennsylvania, and Harvard University. His book, Prince of the Press: How One Collector Built History's Most Enduring and Remarkable Jewish Library, was published by Yale University Press in 2019, and it was named as the winner of the Sela Baron Prize for the American Academy of Jewish Research for Best First Book in Jewish Studies in 2019. He also won the, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, and it's
Sure.
my fault because I guess I didn't explain it properly.
Okay.
Joshua Teplitsky is going to go at the end. So Susan Einbinder is.
Okay, Susan Einbinder. Well,
I'm going to grab that one, or if you want to finish Joshua's bio, you can do that, and then.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna finish. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm gonna finish Joshua's bio, and then I'll also read. Might as well just do them all at once now.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll read Jonathan's, and then we'll go on to Professor Einbinder.
Okay.
So to continue, Joshua won the Sela Baron Prize for American Academy of Jewish Research, and he also won the 2020 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association for Jewish Studies, and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He is currently at work on a book reconstructing a plague epidemic in 18th century Prague and its impact on Jewish social and cultural life in the city. He has been interviewed for his research on epidemics and Jewish life in Times Higher Education and Time Magazine, and has published on the topics of published on these topics in Jewish Social History and the Jewish Quarterly Review, as well as Epidemic Urbanism. So we'll look forward to hearing from Joshua Teplitsky following Jonathan Crane, who I will introduce as well right now. Jonathan Crane is a PhD and a rabbi who serves as the Raymond F. Shinazi Scholar in Bioethics and Jewish Thought at Emory's Center for Ethics. He's a professor of medicine and the director of Food Studies and Ethics Initiative. Crane is a past president of the Society of Jewish Ethics. He's founder and co-editor of the Journal of Jewish Ethics, and author and editor of several books, or the editor of several books, including Narratives and Jewish Bioethics in 2013, the Oxford Handbook of Jewish Ethics and Morality, also in 2013, Beastly Morality, Animals as Ethical Agents, Eating Ethically, Religion and Science for a Better Diet, and Judaism, Race and Ethics, Conversations and Questions. So that is Jonathan Crane, who we'll be hearing from soon. Our next speaker is a renowned medievalist, Susan Einbinder, who received a PhD from Columbia University. She is professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut. From 1993 to 2012, she taught Hebrew literature at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. She has published 3 books: Beautiful Death, Jewish Poetry and Martyrdom from Medieval France, No Place of Rest, Jewish Literature, Expulsion and Memory of France, and which is published in 2019, and a recent book, After the Black Death, Commemoration and Plague Among Iberian Jews, which was a phenomenal book. And she has a book coming out very shortly, Writing Plague, Jewish Responses to the Great Italian Plague, which is scheduled to appear later this year. In 2017, she was elected a Fellow of the Medieval Academy of America, a recipient of fellowships from the National Humanities Center, the Institute of Advanced Study, and the Guggenheim Foundation. She has held visiting faculty appointments at Brown University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She is also an ordinee of the Hebrew Union College. And we will now hear from Professor Einbinder on Jews, Rats, and Fleas, New Perspectives on the Plague.
Actually, her server just went down.
Okay, so we'll hear.
Joshua is going to take it from here, and then when she comes back on, we'll take her next after Joshua.
This is working perfectly.
We'll end with Jonathan Crane. Hopefully he is amenable to that.
Okay, Jonathan, Jonathan, go ahead. Did you have your hand up?
No, I thought I was going now.
Yeah. You go ahead.
Great. Okay, and it sounds like my sound is working.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, very good. Very good. Well, thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to you all for being so fluid with moving these schedules around. It's really an honor to be sharing the fruits of some of my research with you. And I'm so very honored to have been invited to participate in this illustrious conference. It's so nice to be in such an interesting multidisciplinary space. So I thank you for that. The title of this talk is Jews, Pandemics, and Social Exclusion, a Historical Overview. In the autumn of 1713, plague ravaged the city of Prague. It had been a deadly year, with epidemics spreading from across much of Central Europe, from east to west, claiming thousands of lives in its wake. In the midst of this crisis, a Prague rabbi took up his pen to grapple with the plague's impact on the city's Jews, which was the largest urban population in all of Christian Europe at the time. The rabbi's name was Jacob or Yaakov Reicher, and this was not his first encounter with plague. He had lived through an earlier epidemic than this one that we're talking about in the year 1713. He had lived through an earlier epidemic in the year 1680 by repeatedly taking flight with his wife and larger family from different cities and towns as symptoms of disease appeared. This time, in 1713, he was concerned not with the value of voluntary movement to outpace the plague, but rather its opposite, the catastrophic effects of being forced to stay in place. In the midst of a longer legal question and answer, he described the state of affairs in his native Prague as follows. But now, on account of our sins, the burden of exile has multiplied upon us, and the false libels of our enemies, who libel against us that the plague comes on account of Israel. And when there was plague in the year 1713, in many places in which there were members of our people, they had closed the Jewish neighborhood, with literally none coming and none leaving. And at great pains by intercession, they were allowed to bring them necessary alimentation, and in some places they, being other Jews, had to go and hide themselves in forests and caves, and the people of Israel were on the road and fields were abandoned to die, there is no greater captivity than this. Reicher's description accompanied a responsum, a ruling of rabbinic law, and it offers us a vivid portrait of the state of affairs in the Prague ghetto within the larger cityscape as plague spread, telling a story of isolation, exclusion, and differential, even discriminatory treatment. In the brief sentences that you see before you on the screen, he touched upon words and concepts that appear to loom largely in the memory and history of epidemic experience. His account begins with theological concepts of sin and exile, moves to descriptions of the libel of enemies and the placement of blame, then describes the response of authorities. The Jewish neighborhood of Prague, which was encircled by a wall, was sealed shut with, quote, none coming and none leaving, end quote. And finally, the consequences of such a policy. His people abandoned to seek refuge outside of the city in forests and caves, abandoned to die in roads and fields. The rabbi's words also reveal Jewish responses, great pains of intercession in which the Jewish community's leadership worked with local rulers to ameliorate the situation. The text itself represents a response, plumbing Jewish tradition and rabbinic texts to comport law's constancy to the episode of crisis. The rabbi's words invoke themes that appear in variation over the course of centuries of the history of Jews and epidemic experience. Indeed, it was written for precisely that effect, to serve as a sort of precedent for other epidemic events, to express tensions between religious ideals and reality, to frame earthly episodes in theological terms. Importantly for the writing of law, the responsum strives to sound familiar notes, to reveal to us patterns, to not be overly burdened with the details of the immediate episode in order to maintain its transcendence and relevance to be applicable for generations to follow. In short, the responsum is long on drama and short on context, as so many documents about epidemics and inclusion threaten to be. But context is key. In this day full of speakers who are sharing the fruits of their thinking about epidemics from multiple disciplinary and professional vantage points, I'll aim to make just a modest contribution from the perspective of the historian. The task of the historian is not solely to narrate the events of the past, but to attempt to make sense of them by considering their context, by thinking about their sources and the circumstances in which such sources are produced, and the way that events were perceived in their own time by different contemporaries and stakeholders. Today, although my task is to offer a historical overview, I will not be giving a long history of hundreds or even thousands of years of different diseases in different places and how Jews were affected by them, all condensed into about 16 minutes. Rather, instead of an overview of events, I'll take it as my task to provide an interview of the historian's method, the way of asking questions about epidemics in history. For my starting premise is that no two epidemics are quite the same. An epidemic throws into sharp relief the particularities of time and place, of pre-existing relationships, of available resources, of different political ideologies and structures, of ritual, of medical thought, and medical practice, the latter two seldom in lockstep with each other. But the suite of questions and methods that we can apply to understanding different epidemics can be quite similar, whether we're exploring the outbreak of bubonic plague in the 14th century, cholera in the 19th century, HIV/AIDS in the 20th, or COVID-19 in our own. Our vehicle for this methodological overview will be a single case study of a single epidemic episode, with an eye to explicating the event in its wider context, and to think about the experience of the people who lived through it, both collectively and, where possible, individually. In the time that I'll have, I'll gesture towards other epidemics, both to compare and contrast the one in question with others, in order to explore the experience of Jews in historical epidemic. We'll look at three elements. We'll begin by talking about the episode in question itself. We'll then attempt to place it in its wider context, and then we'll think about the perspectives of the people who experienced it. Only with a wider view of the context of medical understanding, pre-existing relationships between Jews and both the state and their ordinary neighbors, and Jews' own institutions and cultures, can we gain a portrait of how events unfold in time and place. The event I've already gestured towards. The first symptoms of bubonic plague appeared in the city of Prague on the 20th of July, 1713. Although plague's arrival was swift and sudden, it was hardly a surprise. The city's medical faculty had been on alert for months as neighboring regions had been overcome by the epidemic, and it seemed only a matter of time before contagion would spread across borders and boundaries. It had broken out in Vienna earlier that year in April and had continued to ravage different parts of the Habsburg monarchy, which you see colored on the screen before you, as well as other parts of the continent. By early July, the Bohemian lands, with Prague as their capital, were ordered sealed shut to transit from Austria in the hopes of protecting it from infiltration of illness, but to no avail. So we're today in the green section at the center of the map. Prague's university medical faculty rapidly collected information about the goings-on about the city and submitted its findings. And on the 26th of July, it sent all of its recently gathered research from Prague to the capital of the Habsburg monarchy in Vienna. The office of the monarchy responded only 5 days later, which means the post traveled quite quickly, on July 31st, at which point medical information gathering was translated into policy. Orders from Vienna back to Prague flowed in rapid succession, closing off the region to outside travelers, initiating a campaign to clean and sanitize the city, regulating burial of the dead, building sick hospitals, hiring teams of doctors and nurses, and sequestering the sick from the healthy. Integral to these directives was a set of orders to segregate the city's Jews from Christians. Among them, prohibitions against the practice of Jewish and Christian washerwomen to labor side by side on the Sabbath and other Jewish festivals, as the document tells us was their common custom. Only a week later, after these instructions were issued, a steady flow of further instructions came about. On the 7th of August, instructions were sent from Vienna to banish all of the non-resident Jews from Prague and the wider kingdom of Bohemia within a span of 3 days, to terminate all activity in the Jewish marketplace of the city, which lay outside of the ghetto walls, and most significantly, to seal all points of access in and out of the ghetto, effectively imprisoning the Jewish population within it. The order took over 2 weeks to implement, and in the interim, hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews fled the tightening vise of the ghetto's enclosure, seeking safety in the countryside, even as they were left without refuge, exposed to the elements. Soon the gates of the ghetto were closed. Points of egress to the rest of the city were boarded up. Thus the rabbinic description with which this presentation began. But this did not mean that Jews were without options. First, Jewish leaders maintained diplomatic relations with the leadership with authorities to work to ameliorate conditions within. Second, Jews organized the means of relief within the community, recruiting a corps of barber surgeons, nurses, watchmen, even a cadre of yeshiva students to study Torah as a spiritual balm to the community. And on the documents that you see up on the screen here are a list of different plague workers salaried in Prague, ranging from people to keep the peace, people to move the bodies of the deceased, people to tend to the sick, and indeed even salaries to young men, only men, not women, but young men to study Torah as, I say, a kind of spiritual prophylactic for the community. The community further produced new prayers and begged God for mercy. They inscribed many of these instructions in their Jewish vernacular, in Yiddish, in surviving documents that we have unto this day, telling us about the recruitment of midwives, of charity officers, of different means of relief. So much for the event. There's much more that follows. By the close of this event, approximately a third of the number of Jews living in the ghetto's lives had been claimed. And the same proportion of Christians died in the rest of the city as well. It's at this point that we must turn to explore larger contexts, for if we go looking for moments of exclusion, we're certain to find them. Indeed, it's usually only when states make people the object of their attention that we can find traces of them in the archive. Conversely, it is all too easy to overlook the silences of the archive and the stability that they imply. Things appear in the archive only when they are jolted out of the ordinary. If we neglect epidemics in which no special mention is made of Jews, and in which no record of their exclusion appears, we run the risk of skewing our results, we'll find only exactly what we're looking for. We must therefore use an array of sources that expand the lens of observation to ask questions like, how different was a focus on Jews from a focus on other parties in the city? Was there a strict binary between Jews and non-Jews, or were there numerous groups who had differential treatment? How pervasive were acts of discrimination against Jews, and how significant? And how different were Jews from other forms of designated others, like the poor, criminals, or even medical staff, all of whom in different times of epidemic history have been pointed at as being responsible for the very plague that raged in their midst. Perhaps the most important context for exploring a single epidemic is thinking about the outbreak of the epidemic in the context of its recurrence. Numerous times today, we've already mentioned, or folks have mentioned today, the Black Death. And for Jewish history, the Black Death perhaps looms the largest as the cataclysmic event of circa 1348, against which so many later outbreaks of plague and others are retrospectively measured. A simple Google search from March and April, May, June, and July of 2020 present recurring discussions about Jews and the Black Death. It becomes this point of reference for all sorts of later discussions. But that horrible episode was in some ways unique, as a pandemic that brought with it the shock of novelty and the concomitant search for suspects. The Black Death was but the first of a recurrence of bubonic plague from the 14th through the 18th centuries, a period of nearly 4 centuries in which this epidemic recurred and became nearly endemic, a period historians refer to as the Second Great Pandemic, to distinguish it from an earlier pandemic of, we think, bubonic plague in the 6th century, and another that began in the 19th and is not fully complete to this day. If I understand correctly, there are still a number of outbreaks of bubonic plague every year in the American Southwest, the home of the hosts of our conference right now. Plague recurred regularly throughout the later Middle Ages and into the 18th century, and was recognized by contemporaries as a near seasonal affair. It didn't recur annually, but it was certain to come at least once during one's lifetime, like in the writing of our Rabbi Reischer that's been guiding us through this discussion today, and it predictably struck in the warmer months and receded in the cold. Medical manuals produced throughout the early modern period often noted the very fact that plague would strike in the spring and would recede by late autumn and early winter, and ruling authorities often attempted to wait out the plague, hoped against hope that as the winter months would come, it would die out. It was part of the natural order of lived experience in the environment. It was not an element of surprise or extraordinariness, and it did not beg the attribution to human agency or the sinister motives of conspirators. Rather, plague was often understood by early modern people, both professional and ordinary, within 2 immediate causal contexts, the first being mobility and the second being pollution. How had the 1713 plague spread? In this case, we have the good fortune of a document that has left behind one man's reconstruction of plague's entry into Prague, and if it is to be believed, it led through merchant networks. With plague's appearance in Prague, a 26-year-old doctor by the name of Alexander Anton Ignat Shamsky raced to produce a guide for lay people to treat and prevent the worst of the illness. His book was printed in Prague in October of 1713 and followed the conventions of a genre of plague writing that had emerged in the 17th century that traced the path of plague from its point of entry to its impact. Shamsky focused his account on the most mobile members of the population, considering the case first of a soldier's wife, before resting on the influx of Jews who had recently arrived in the city from Poland, some of whom were in flight from local plague, others who were simply part of the routine transit of goods between Poland and Prague, especially traders in fur. Shamsky, the doctor, associated Jews with epidemic disease, but he did so without directly attributing blame to them, and no consideration of them as deliberate facilitators of spread with any sort of malicious intent. Indeed, government regulation of Jewish mobility was more often less about Jews and more about their actions. A single day in the life of this epidemic is actually quite instructive. On the 3rd of August, 1713, a series of seemingly contradictory instructions issued from the royal and imperial offices of the Habsburg monarchy in Vienna and its representatives in the Prague castle that loomed above the city. It began with a near complete ban on movement across the Austrian or Austro-Bohemian border, with way stations and checkpoints at major crossings designed to inspect the movement of people and goods between them. The only small exception to that near total ban were people who carried health passports with them that had been issued by central offices in Vienna. All other forms of documentation and their carriers would be turned away from the border. Notwithstanding that firm outer border, however, movement within the boundaries of the Bohemian monarchy had been approved by the highest authorities of the land. On the selfsame day as the outer limits of the territory were being fortified by Habsburg decree, a second order affirmed, not prohibited, Jews' rights of mobility. In response to petty nobles of lower rank than the monarchy itself, who sought to bar Jews from entering and exiting, or specifically entering or even passing through their lands and domains in the midst of plague, the monarchy overrode the rule of the nobles and approved the unfettered mobility of Jewish residents, in no small part on account of their important service to the wider economy and the monarchy's recognition of it. The monarchy thus affirmed a rigid divide between the dangerous movement of outsiders into the region, who might bring plague with them, and the necessity of facilitating internal mobility in order to maintain the flow of commerce and the economic health of the realm itself. Jews were not, in this case, essentialized. It was not who they were as radically different that made them linked to plague. It was what they did, their economic role. And they, alongside others who were across the frontier and would import plague with them, were distinguished from those who only moved in the orbit within the boundaries of the kingdom. If mobility was one object of attention, space and sanitation formed another. The Jews of Prague were hemmed in by ghetto walls, with no room for expansion, a theme that has already been adumbrated in some of the other talks today. As early as the 16th century, an English traveler to Prague by the name of Finis Morrison recorded his impressions of the city after a 2-month sojourn there, observing that, quote, at Prague, many families of Jews live packed together in one little house, which makes not only their homes, but their streets to be very filthy, and their city to be like a dunghill. Not a particularly pleasant report, but a plausible one. By the 18th century, state records of the period describe a population of over 11,000 Jewish residents crammed into a mere 365 houses, averaging as many as 40 people to a building. It thus stands to reason that the concerns of city and royal authorities over the likelihood of Jews in their neighborhood as being particularly susceptible to disease may well have been correct. If the differential treatment of Jews was thus not deeply principled, it certainly was practiced. And here's where we get to another important point. Policies that related to Jews were based upon prior arrangements that were not necessarily rooted in persecution, but they were often, if not always, inflected by policies that were designed to differentiate, distinguish, and often to discriminate against the presence of Jews in a given city. In other words, the conditions that contributed to contagion were the outcome of long-standing treatment of Jews in many parts of early modern Europe. Jews' neighborhoods may have been more susceptible to disease. They may not have just been scapegoated as with myths that are plucked from thin air, but the reasons that those neighborhoods were more likely to have been susceptible to disease were the outcome of long-standing political arrangements. Jews in many places in Italy and Central Europe, as well as other parts of the continent, lived in separate neighborhoods, sometimes Jewish quarters, sometimes ghettos, and oftentimes this arrangement served Jews, as well as Christians, quite well. Jewish authors, memoirists, diarists, rabbis, and beyond, from the early modern period, often wrote approvingly of the walls and gates that separated them from their Christian neighbors. But in times of crisis, those walls could be converted into a prison, and a poisonous prison at that. Jews were confined in space, and those confined spaces defined their experiences of epidemic. In various ghettos in Florence, Rome, Padua, Prague, Frankfurt, Krakow, as far off as Crete, some of which did not even have official ghettos, Jewish residence was generally constrained, and natural population growth meant tightly cramped quarters with little to no room for expansion. It's thus no wonder that when Jacob Reischer, the rabbi from the start of this presentation, named the greatest ill of his moment, it was not the epidemic itself, but rather the constraints of the ghetto, the gates of which had been sealed shut in order to prevent contagion from spreading throughout the rest of the city, even though such measures did little. One Yiddish account, we've got all kinds of interesting documents that are produced just from this one epidemic outbreak. One Yiddish account described the scene as follows. In this state of cruelty, people rose up against each other, even wife against husband, father and mother turned against their own child, and even a child could rise up against his own father and mother. And even if he was a good person, as soon as someone was suspected of sickness, people fled from him, for their lives were at stake. The distinct and different status of the Jewish quarter of Prague, as Jewish quarters in other places, featured administratively as well. In the document you see on the screen before you, in which careful records of the sick and dying were kept by neighborhood, the Jewish neighborhood received a line item all its own, marking out its distinction from the rest of the city. With all that said, though, exclusion may offer us windows into interaction. From the perspective of the historian, we can think about moments of exclusion during an epidemic as taking place within the context of crisis and rupture. And we must therefore think about how a moment of exclusion can tell us much more about the rhythms that this moment punctuates than just about the moment itself. What forms of engagement or interaction preceded this moment and were affected by it? Which is not to say complete harmony or coexistence, but amid the horrors of this health and social crisis, patterns of contact and coexistence are also made visible, not in spite of, but precisely because of the upheaval. Thus, the monarchy's instructions to segregate Jews from their neighbors during the plague both implicitly and explicitly reflected the otherwise manifold contacts that Jewish and Christian residents of the city maintained on a daily basis up and down the economic ladder. This is an evidence from the hint earlier about restrictions that were placed particularly on Christian women, presumably domestic workers, which sought to prevent them from doing their washing and other housework alongside Jewish women on holidays and festivals. In fact, such restrictions were quite common, but they related not only to the people involved, but to their actions and objects. One of the most dangerous items during the plague was cloth. It was understood to carry disease, and many plague ordinances regulated its movement, sale, and resale. Once it had been suspected that Jewish neighborhoods were a breeding ground of disease, it stands to reason that special instructions were put in place to bar Christian washerwomen from exposure to cloth that had come from that neighborhood. This is not again about essential identities, but rather about circumstances that evolve and change over the course of an epidemic. Such contacts appear not only among laboring domestics, but also in the domains of the wealthy, as in cases of Jews who had the resources to flee the city of Prague, but left their goods in the trusted safekeeping of Christians, expecting to retrieve them upon their return. This case, which once again provoked the injunctions of the authorities, reflects the quotidian context of trust, familiarity, and neighborliness, rather than exclusion and scapegoating that existed even in a time of chaos and fear. In other words, in our exploration of forms of exclusion, we are well served to think about exclusion by whom. At times, forms of animus certainly were fueled by ordinary people, rather than political or religious leadership. But at other times, state attempts to limit Jewish-Christian engagement show us that such engagement was a norm, only disrupted by the epidemic outbreak. In some occasions, such as the Black Death, church and state authorities were at the forefront of the defense of Jews against the popular frenzies of murderous fear. And Jews' own perceptions of even this particular epidemic recall the protections granted by ruling authorities. The same Yiddish poem quoted earlier tells its readers, quote, many Jews received the favor of the authority, who presided and protected them. Even as other sources from other times and places tell us about the fear Jews had of rulers and the ways they attempted to conceal potential outbreaks of plague from people that ruled over them, still these documents tell us about Jewish trust. In sum, the task of the historian is not only to know the events of the past, but to make meaning of them by carefully reconstructing events in context, resisting transhistorical rules, to understand the reasons that events transpired as they did, the motivations of different actors, and the constraints individuals and communities faced. To explain, however, is not to explain away, nor is it to justify. But it's my hope that these tools will offer us ways to understand the past in all of its richness and terror on its own terms. Only by fully understanding the specific circumstances of past events can we attempt to grapple with the causative power of circumstances in the present and to provide us with the means to make better futures for ourselves and others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh. That was an excellent presentation. I would like to ask Susan Einbinder now to now that she's back with us. I've already introduced her before, and so she'll be speaking to us about Jews, Rats, and Fleas, new perspectives on plague. But before that, I just also want to remind everybody to please put your questions into the Q&A box so that we can have a discussion later on. So please, Professor Einbinder.
Thank you. And thank you to Josh for stepping in while I rebooted my laptop. And I'm very grateful to you. So first, the bad news for the flea lovers is that the fleas of my original title await a future discussion. And today's talk explores Jewish rodent relations on the eve of the Black Death, drawing on several 13th century representations to ask about the spaces of Jewish rodent encounters. Rodents, of course, are the primary, not the only, but in Europe especially, the primary animal host for Yersinia pestis, the plague bacillus, which is transmitted from the rodent to a human by a flea vector, and lice are also possible vectors I am not considering today. So to some extent, this study has been motivated by the old myth that medieval Jews were less afflicted by plague than their Christian neighbors. And this is a myth that has been invoked to explain plague-related violence against Jews during the Black Death. It is equally a myth that has been popular among Jews who claim superior hygiene among their ancestors deterred disease. And Josh Teplitsky has surveyed all sides of this claim brilliantly, and you should read his recent article in the AJS Review. In fact, we know too little about the material conditions of medieval Jewish life as they might matter for plague. Indeed, we know very little of Jewish experience during the Black Death, which has been subordinated by the scarcity of the sources to the more familiar tropes of anti-Jewish violence. Even facts of statistical mortality elude us. There is no evidence that Jewish communities exhibited superior immunity to plague in the 14th century or after, but there's very little evidence of what their experience of plague was at all. So my talk today asks what a rodent-sized view might contribute to this question. I draw on three texts that in different ways disclose the everyday presence of rodents in Jewish life: Isaac ibn Sahula's Mishal HaKadmoni and the Sefer Hasidim are 13th century compositions, and the third text by Chaim Vital offers a 16th century contrast. Akhbar in Hebrew does not distinguish among rodent types like Latin, and I leave unresolved the precise category of these rodents. They may be rats or mice. The medieval texts distinguish only between commensal and sylvatic species, perhaps by default also distinctions of size. The examples demonstrate that mice, rats, and other rodent species cross the radar and geography of Jewish life in multiple ways, opening a way to describe a plague ecology for these communities. Significantly, they all see rodents as nuisances, not carriers of disease, although Vital's perspective is significantly medicalized. The medieval emphasis on food spoilage comes in the context of a trans-European and Mediterranean grain network under increasing stress at the end of the medieval warming period. Thus, these representations light up the connections between urban and rural, inside and outside spaces that plague historians have been increasingly drawn to elucidate, giving us a freeze frame of multi-species mobilities and plague ecology on the eve of the Black Death. It is not coincidental that they show up in Jewish writing when they do. By the mid to late 13th century, there were probably more rodents around, and that too would make a pandemic difference. Isaac ibn Sahula completed his Mishal HaKadmoni in Castile in the late 13th century, 1280s. The work consists of 5 books, each featuring a debate between a cynic and a moralist who illustrate their arguments with fables or tales, whose protagonists also tell fables or tales in a kind of Russian doll structure. Book 3 opens with the cynic's tale of a peasant from Tugrama who grows silkworms, and he takes them a 3 days journey to a city market. Tugrama here likely refers to Sicily, where crude silk was produced and marketed at this period. But as with other tales in this work, Ibn Sahula may be recasting a local setting. The peasant also carries stones, which the silk merchant will buy to sharpen weapons. Most likely, he's referring to some kind of quartz, which is found in northern Iberia. Ibn Sahula's moralist responds with the tale of a king from the hill country in the Holy Land, perhaps another coded Iberian setting. The king tells a tale of a rat, a weasel, and a shepherd. The weasel is also a storyteller, admonishing the rat with the tale of a miser outside Safed who exploits travelers carrying drugs and spices. And this chapter will close with a glutton whose immoderate feasting is observed by a wretched beggar, servants, and a sage. Book 3's interwoven stories expose a wide Mediterranean network of movement and trade in which Jews played important roles. Silk moved around the Mediterranean, coming from the east and Sicily and making its way to eager buyers in Castile. Transhumance, the annual transfer of flocks up and down the mountains, still stops traffic in Spain. Wool, meat, and dairy products were important commodities. Jewish middlemen sometimes observed cheese production in the herds. They also figured in the expanding trade in silk and wool goods from the west eastward, and in the market for spices and pharmaceuticals moving in the opposite direction. And here too, we see evidence of a lively traffic in goods and people, east and west, with a trendy interest in pharmaceuticals. So the shepherd has constructed a temporary hut in the mountains. With surplus milk, he makes cheese, which is quickly discovered by 2 rodents, a huda and an akhbar, usually translated as weasel and rat. The 2 animals appear one after the other in Leviticus 11, verse 29, where they are both prohibited for consumption. Real weasels are rat and mouse predators, but in the fable, they amiably share underground quarters, and the rat even offers to share his anticipated heist of cheese. And when the weasel warns him to avoid the shepherd's baited trap, he ignores her advice and meets a predictable end. I got my first slide, please. We're fortunate to have illustrations of the trap. One from the lavish Rothschild miscellany, it's a 15th century copy, and one from a 1547 Venice printed edition. Here you see them side by side. And the same model, and if you think that's a mouse or a rat, you can vote. But the same model trap shows up in an early 15th century Christian painting produced in southern France, a famous Merode altarpiece, with its depiction of Joseph in one panel of the triptych fashioning a mouse trap, while Mary tends to events of more global significance in the center. My next slide, please. Thank you. There you see him. And actually you can see on the right, I gave you a close-up. There's a a finished or almost finished mousetrap out the window there, and then there's one right on his work table, right? So the mousetraps are very similar. The one, although the shepherd is camping in the mountains and the Holy Family is in town, so urban, peri-urban, and rural spaces are traversed by knowledge as well as by humans, animals, and goods. The rats and mice move too, impervious to human barriers, and their presence is clearly a nuisance, not a threat. This view is confirmed by our second text, the Sefer Hasidim. Its chief author, Judah Hasid, died in 1217, but as Ivan Marcus reminds us, the multiple recensions of his writings constituted a cottage industry after his death. The Bologna edition that contains the following passage may have been born in France outside of Paris. I take Regensburg, Judah's home, and a pietist redoubt as the geographical backdrop to this passage. And in paragraph 1008, we read, my next slide there, if that's possible. Yes, someone asked a sage, rodents have eaten from my bread, may I eat from it? And the sage responds, why not? He answered him, lest I forget my learning, Talmudi. I'm wary of eating anything that might cause forgetting my learning, but now I am hungry. The sage replied, you're not culpable, quote, unless you deliberately remove your studies from your heart, right? He's quoting Pirkei Avot. I see that you are not occupied with Torah, but idle when you might be. All day you do nothing, the Torah says, but go about with ignoramuses and listen to their foolishness. It would be better for you if you didn't avoid foods that cause forgetfulness, so you might forget some of your foolish doings. It's a great story, right? The text draws on a Talmudic passage in Horayot 13a, which lists foods that are good or bad for memory. The Talmudic claim is peculiar and its origins unclear. Babylonian medical and magical texts preserve recipes to inhibit field pests, but not domestic ones. Other rabbinic passages assert that mice are half earth and half basar, flesh, an unnatural hybridity that may have caused unease, but not forgetfulness. Likewise, neither Dioscorides nor Galen associates rodent-spoiled foodstuffs with memory loss. The sage invokes a Mishnaic passage, Avot 3:8, which states that someone who forgets one word of his learning merits death. However, this does not apply to someone who struggles with learning unless he deliberately sets it aside. So the rabbi's opinion of his interlocutor is clear. It's also clear that mice or rats in the pantry were a problem. The medieval Jewish communities of Ashkenaz and Sfarad did not live in ghettos. While many communities clustered in neighborhoods or quarters, these were porous spaces, rarely exclusively Jewish. They were often situated close to market and traffic centers, and discriminatory housing was not a concern. Happily, the excavation of Regensburg's Jewish quarter has taught us a lot about their housing. Although the early medieval dwellings were wood or wood on stone, the early 13th century saw them all renovated and converted to stone on stone foundations with a significant rodent deterrent. Underground pathways connected an astonishing number of cellars. There was a bakery, a warehouse, and a slaughterhouse, but no granary. Atypically, the handsome synagogue opened onto the Christian market area, and the main street, wide enough for carts, led to the highways and out to the river. The quarter was not exclusively inhabited by Jews, and few of the houses were owned by them. Where did Jews get grain and mill it into flour? Surprisingly, we do not know much about this. However, grain from Castile to Cologne was cash. Secular and ecclesiastical lords paid peasants in grain, and lords and peasants made purchases and paid debts in grain. Jews took grain as payment and pledges and are occasionally accused of speculating in grain markets. In some parts of medieval Europe, Jews did take over Christian mills, in one case a granary, but they were not restricted to Jewish use. Grain mattered. Across Europe, as the warmer, crop-friendly years of the medieval climate anomaly yielded to cycles of bad harvests, municipalities bought grain and resold it to distributors who brought it to town. Purchased there, it was then sent to be milled. So Jewish grain was unlikely to be stored near their housing, although flour may have been. More likely, Jews rented space in Christian warehouses outside the city walls. Not all German Jewish communities even had bakeries, which meant renting space or buying Christian bread. If our hungry protagonist does not spend his time reading, neither apparently does he do much else productive. His bread has no provenance or history, and he and his tiny visitor have no families. This Jew is not an empiric or a physician either. His worry is not medicalized, but religious. His memory is good enough to have retained some youthful association to that passage in Horayot 13a. Given the rich legacy of late antique memory practices in Ashkenaz, this makes sense and testifies to the circulation of memory texts and practices linked to do and don't foods. Other things circulate too. Rats move from granaries to mills and into town on carts. Mice, even in Regensburg's stone dwellings, move through urban spaces and human barriers. Grain moves from field to pantry, and the mysterious association of memory loss with rodents moved also from the rabbinic text our poor Jew wasn't studying to a medieval urban legend. Whatever they did to your memory, rodents were ubiquitous. Accordingly, Jews kept their books in trunks, and monks lamented their nibbled manuscripts. One canon discussion even treats the problem of a mouse-nibbled Eucharist. My sense is that mice and rats show up even more in the early modern sources in literature and art, but tellingly in municipal regulations with budgets for rat catchers, street cleaners, and the disposal of dead animals in the streets. Chaim Vital's Kabbalah Ma'asit Ve'alchimia belongs to this new sensibility. Among its wealth of medieval and early modern recipes, many treat practical topics ranging from metalwork and medicine to making soap, detergent, or textile dyes. One whole section features recipes for repelling or eradicating various pests: bedbugs, fleas, lice, ants, worms, slugs, snakes, and rodents. Vital took a multi-pronged approach to household rodents, ranging from repellents to poisons. The simplest repellent is water, he says, because mice chew clothing for the moisture. Set out a bowl of water and you will save your shirts. An escalated response employs arsenic, realgar. But since mice are cautious eaters, a little flour or oil mixed with spices or cheese should be added to camouflage the poison. Even better, a mix of two types of arsenic was preferred. White arsenic, the more lethal, was also more likely to excite suspicion, but a small amount could be mixed with a weaker yellow arsenic with flour and cheese and then placed by the mouse holes. And just to cover all bases, Vital adds instructions for a rodent repellent amulet. These images should be drawn on 4 unused clay pots. My next picture, please. There they are. And one pot goes in each corner, and then the text is on my last slide. Over the first pot, say, leave this house and never return to it. This house is forbidden to you. Over the second pot, say, mice, mice, leave this house in the secret name of God who has created you and do not return. Over the third pot, say, mice, mice, leave this house and do not return from this day until the resurrection of the dead. And over the fourth pot, say, mice, mice, soon none of you will remain in this house, soon, soon. So despite this amulet's medieval ancestry, there is a striking change between the medieval text and his. Vital manages rodents with new technologies, drugs especially, deployed as boundary markers as much as toxins. His rodents also come in families and less as food predators than destroyers of textiles, which is noteworthy in a port city and major textile center. They're not associated with disease, but the arsenal amassed to control them suggests that they are associated with sanitation and a greater urban sensibility that linked public and domestic hygiene with health. Did the mice and rats notice the difference? Yes, because they adapted to. We know that because brown rats will replace black rats, and rats and mice are still here. Seeing the rodents and Jewish human spaces, commodities, and mobilities is a first step toward understanding their encounter with plague. But the medieval texts also capture a European period of growth and productivity that is beginning to come under strain. The cyclic famines of the mid to late 13th century were triggered by drought, floods, changes in land use, and the depredations of war. By the early 14th century, we see governments intervening to stockpile grain, regulate grain prices, monitor fraud, and protect grain warehouses from enemy attack. The Great Famine ravaged Europe between 1317 to 21. Regional harvest failures and famines appear throughout the 1330s, and the Black Death was around the corner. These texts give us a freeze-frame picture of the easy traffic across urban and rural, Jewish and Christian, human and rodent spaces that characterize this world on the eve of the Black Death. And rodents are not just crossing Jewish radar around 1300 because they're trendy or cute. Neither are they medical menaces. They are, however, plentiful. And this is my final point. There are more of them, just as there are more people who live in bigger towns and cities and denser housing. The movement of grain and meat and cheese from country to town has intensified, and so has a taste for luxury commodities, silks, and high-end textiles, spices, and pharmaceuticals. On ships and in grain carts and granaries, mills and bakeries, in bread boxes and walls, rodents have been thriving too. And then they won't. First, it will be the harvest, then the droughts and flooding, the shift to colder weather, and the wars of human beings. Then Yersinia pestis, which is already moving across Asia and will land in Crete in the summer of 1347. But as far as we can tell from this snapshot before that catastrophe, there's nothing to suggest that Jewish communities or spaces should fare any differently from those of Christians. More research will tell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's kind of a frightening thought in some ways that here we are, at the brink of another pandemic or middle of another pandemic. So I'd like to now ask Jonathan Crane to speak, and he'll be talking to us about zoonotic pandemics, pigs, power, and knowledge.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation so far. I hope that you can see my screen. And where we're going to go, given that we don't have a whole lot of time, we are going to talk about sort of the context and scope of what pandemics and pigs have to do in the Judaic textual tradition. We're going to then look at some of the religious resources that I have been able to find. And we're going to see that it unfolds in 3 major chapters. The first one will talk about flesh, the second one will talk about metaphors, and the third one will turn to science. And then we'll talk for a few moments about some of the implications of this study. So the first section is just to sort of contextualize this whole conversation. So it was understood that diseases rage among human beings, and they also, has long been observed, that animals also get sick. But then there were some questions about, is there any relationship between the kinds of diseases that animals and humans endure? And some thought that it would be possible for a disease to move from animals and cross the species boundary and infect human beings. And this in common parlance is called zoonosis. And then there's the question of, well, can human beings infect and sicken non-human animals? And that's called anthropognosis. And there were a variety of different mechanisms that contemporary science has found that facilitate the transfer of diseases. Now, of course, many of these, most, I should say, in fact, all of them were unknown to earlier pre-modern societies primarily because they're very small. And so the subocular world was merely hypothetical to them. But today we are able to see those tiny things, and we see that there is an extraordinary amount of pressure being put on animals that has increased their effectiveness of transferring some of these kinds of disease vectors onto human beings. And so zoonosis, or zoonotic diseases, has been increasing over time, and I'll point to that in just a moment. But not all animals are the same. It's really important for us to be able to distinguish between domesticated animals that we keep inside of our houses, and Professor Einbinder's comments about rodents blurs this whole boundary of whether these animals that are not necessarily domesticated but are in our domiciles, they are also very important for us to pay attention to, as are animals that are out in the wild. Wild animals are well known to be carriers of a variety of different diseases that come to be zoonotic. Also, we have animals that are in our research universities, and we do a whole lot in and through animal bodies. We impose diseases onto them so as to study their progression, as well as to figure out some sort of pharmaceutical interventions that would be appropriate for human applications. And then, of course, there are the animals that are caught up in human economic interests. And this could be from clothing animals to bedding, the down that's in your comforter, to the animals that we consume. So there's a whole lot of animals that we are surrounded by, that we have very intimate relationships with, and it is there really should be no question then that they are great vectors and sources of diseases for us. In fact, 60% of known infectious diseases and 75% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, and this is just a small list of some of them in recent decades and centuries. Now, human beings have long been infected and impacted by zoonotic diseases, and we've thought for several millennia about how this could come about. And in the pre-modern world, miasma theory was one of the more dominant and popular theories. It certainly was found in the Western world, but it was also given expression in Eastern civilizations as well. And its major tenet is that this is glossing over a lot of details, but more or less that pollution is the primary cause of disease, and it would be the pollution around animals would then bring some sort of disease upon human populations. It was in the 19th century that Koch and Pasteur developed the whole notion of germ theory, because they could now see in the subocular world through their microscopes. And they began to look at germs and bacteria in particular as the source, as the first source of subocular tiny mechanisms to infect human beings. And they found the relationship between diseases being present in animal populations to movement into human beings. And my argument is that even though the scientific community has recently learned about zoonosis and anthropognosis, people have long known about these transfers of diseases. In fact, we have evidence in religious resources about this transference, and we're going to turn our attention to that. I bring to this study a couple of sort of theoretical schools of thought. I draw from public health, pandemic studies, and the notion of hosts as villains. And that helps us to think about vectors and binaries and hierarchies. Biomobility studies is really useful. It helps us to think about how diseases unify, globalize, segregate, and authorize certain populations to speak about certain diseases, especially pandemics. And animal studies is, of course, extraordinarily helpful in this conversation because it helps us think about what is identity, what constitutes difference, and whether human beings are in fact indistinctive to non-human animals. There are a variety of other fields of study that are relevant here, and I'll bring those up at the tail end of my presentation. So let's begin at the beginning of all things. It is understood from the Judaic textual tradition that there were a variety of things that were bequeathed to the world when it was created. And in fact, one of them is that there were 10 plagues that were sent down to the world. Pigs, according to the Talmud, took 9 of those. So in other words, it's understood from a very early stage in Judaic thinking that swine were particularly sickly. Where did it go? There it is. And this is the vignette that caught my eye while I was traversing the Talmud one day. And it's, I think, profound. It's fascinating. It refers to the colleagues, the sages coming to Rav Judah. And they tell him that there's a pestilence that has arisen among pigs. Judah decrees a fast immediately upon hearing that. The Gemara wonders, well, they wonder what is the rationale behind Judah's decree. So they ponder, let us say that Rav Judah maintains that a plague affects one species will come to affect all species. And that is why he decreed it fast. They answer their own question. Well, that can't actually be the reason. In fact, in other words, if a sickness arises in any other species, there's no cause for human concern or action. Rather, pigs are different, since their intestines are similar to human beings. Thus, their diseases might spread to human beings. It was this tiny little vignette that caught my eye, and I wanted to chase it down. And so the story that I'm about to tell over the next 11 minutes is basically the life of this tiny little vignette. Rashi comes along to give us a little bit more clarity on why human beings, and Jews in particular, should be concerned about the welfare of swine. It is, according to him, because of their internal organs. They don't have multiple stomachs like other beasts. And for this reason, when they get ill, this is a bad sign. He is following along not the famous, but a popular notion that human beings should really study and pay attention to pig morphology and physiology. And this here is a woodcut from the 16th century by Vesuvius, who was very famous for his woodcuts, especially on biomedical interests. And here he is showing the ancient Greek Dr. Galen giving a lesson to other ancient Greek physicians, but he's doing so by dissecting a pig. In other words, we should pay attention to the actual flesh of swine in order for us to know what to do with and for human beings. And the Tosafot come along in the 12th and 13th century to augment this concern. And they start thinking now in terms of metaphors. So moving away from the actual flesh of swine. They say that we should pay attention to pigs because when there's a plague among idolaters, there's fear that it will come to infect Jews. And all the more so that we should do so because Gentiles are similar to the people of Israel. So they're analogizing what is going on among pigs to what is going on among human beings, what's going on among Gentiles and what will go along among Jewish populations. The Meiri continues along the same lines. Jews who live among idolaters, those who don't believe in the existence of God, they are like beasts compared to those of us who are more fidelis to Jewish theology. Their bodies, nonetheless, there is no difference between these and those. And thus, when those Jews get sick, we too should fast. We should assume that the same reason that causes some sort of pain or suffering or loss to pigs would also become a reason for human suffering as well. So again, what he is doing is he's metaphorizing, if that's a verb. He's saying that sick pigs are like sick Jews, sick in the head Jews. And if they get sick, we should be paying attention and responding in kind, or responding appropriately. Joseph Caro chimes in here, and he says that indeed we should be doing this because all the more so if there's pestilence among idolaters that is not yet arisen in Jewish populations, we must fast. So here we can see the analogy that sick pigs are likened to human beings and sick Gentiles are likened to Jews. And there's a lot more details here, but given the time, I just want to speed through it. There is a watershed moment, however. And that watershed moment is, as we have seen so far in the conversations and the presentations throughout the day, are the Black Death as well as the bubonic plagues that really decimate European populations for several hundreds of years. And this gives rise in the early modern period to a whole new way of thinking about the world. Now, evidence, experience, and empiricism combine into what I'm going to call science. And we see evidence of this this new way of thinking about the world in Judaic resources. So here, Mordechai Yaffe talks about this Ta'anit source, and he says that when there is pestilence, it is investigated whether it actually is the case that there's pestilence, to be so among them, among either the pigs or among the human beings, because we are afraid that it will also spread to human beings. And therefore, all the more so, this is the case that there's pestilence among Gentiles and not Jews. We should fast so that it won't spread. Fasting, it should be understood, was an ancient protocol that was thought to be efficacious to protect communities against a whole variety of different conundrums. It could have been the plague, it could have been an earthquake, it could have been about buildings falling down. Fasting was considered to be some sort of balm or protection against these kinds of dangers. But what's interesting here is this new verb that is now being inserted into the whole conversation. The whole idea is to not rely upon the hearsay that Rabbi Judah received. He heard it from his colleagues that there was some sort of pandemic among the pigs that Gentiles were farming. But now the challenge is to not just rely upon what is being transmitted orally, but to now go investigate it. This is the turn to science. And this ruling is now picked up multiple times in later resources. And finally, in the late 19th century, Epstein in his Aruch HaShulchan comes down to amplify this turn to science. He says that that if it's found that there's no pestilence among Jews, but there is among human beings, we should fast. And if there's pestilence among the beasts, we only fast if it's among pigs, because again, of their physiological similarity to human beings. And they wrote now that we do not decree a fast on account of pestilence, for it is an examined and tested fact that pestilential air absorbed by the body in the absence of feeding and watering. So he is adding a double verb that is not found before the pre-modern period. It is this turn to investigating and testing, this turn to scientific corroboration of what has been transmitted orally that is, I think, an extraordinary turn, that we no longer rely only upon revelation as a source of authority to determine what a community should do, nor do we rely upon precedent, what previous generations might have done. We now need to go out and use a different source of information to guide appropriate behavior for communities, especially in the face of a zoonotic disease. And here they are saying that we need to go and really develop a rigorous scientific body of knowledge. And here, what he's actually showing is that science is showing that, frankly, we ought not fast. Because when you do fast, you absorb the pollution much faster. You weaken the body. It is much better by the late 19th century to actually continue to feed yourself in the face of a pandemic. So we can raise an eyebrow about the call to fast, because today we don't fast when we're facing pandemic. But I think what's really important here is this turn to scientific evidence as a legitimate way to justify new activities to protect Jews individually and collectively. Now, that was all about zoonosis. What about anthropognosis? Can human beings sicken non-human animals? And here I would suggest turning to the Ikhwan al-Safa al-Kulan al-Wafa, a collection of Muslim scholars and sages. They were very much cosmopolitan, drawing from a variety of different sources outside of the Islamic tradition. And they compiled extant knowledge around the 10th century into their massive encyclopedia. And in their tractate looking at natural resources, the natural world and animals in particular, they have something called The Case of the Animals versus Man in the Court of the King of the Jinn. It's quite a title and an amazing story. Embedded in it is plenty of species come and talk. And the bird speaks, basically saying that ultimately, it comes down to the fact that you human beings, we accuse you human beings for sickening us, especially farmed animals like pigs. They succumb to the diseases that afflict you. Being near you human beings, how you house us, how you husband us, and how you feed us, it is all a way to get us sick. So, these sources and others that I have come across, I think really enrich and can be plumbed from a variety of different sort of studies. And these are just a few of them. And I've started my own sort of look at these resources and others that I haven't mentioned here. And these are just some of the studies that are either published or forthcoming. And one reason why I think it's important for us to pay attention to this tiny little vignette about Rav Judah being told that there are pandemics among pigs is that we do need, what he does is he immediately engages in proactive public health measures that were the best in his day. And I think that we need to take that quite seriously. Now that we know that there are zoonotic diseases ravaging certain populations and have the potential to become global pandemics, we need to take this quite seriously. And we should also be taking quite seriously the role of animal husbandry practices. The specifics of this particular vignette are talking about swine that were husbanded in a particular way by particular populations, and it became a danger to Jewish populations. And so this is suggestive that Jews need to pay attention to how all animals are being husbanded everywhere and anywhere, because they ultimately will generate zoonotic diseases that could very well be another global pandemic. And contemporary science, again, is encouraging us to pay attention to this insight that we find in the Talmud. That is my story for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this. I will now turn it over to you. We have about 10 minutes for discussion. So I don't see anything in the Q&A. So you're welcome to raise your hand.
Ava just raised her hand.
Yeah, you could raise your hand digitally or in your incarnated. Okay, yeah, Chava.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, thank you all for this incredibly rich and well-informed, terrific presentations. I've learned so much. Jonathan, I would like to go to your presentations. I have some problems with the terminology as translated. If you can go to the slide about Mordechai Yofi, slide, and then the next slide. Those two, I'm not sure I would read that text the way you proposed. So can you get us to that point? I don't know. Because this really depends on the Hebrew. So either I misunderstood the text or there's a problem with the translation. So is it here? No. Yeah, מדבק. כיוון שהדבר מדבק בהם. That, I would translate that because that thing is attached to them or adheres to them or something like that. So the shoresh here, the root is dalet bet kuf. Whereas in the next slide, the shoresh is bet dalet kuf. So I think that I would not translate midabek as investigated. I don't think that's a correct reading here. Where is it? Yeah, let's go back, if you can go back to the, yeah. So here, yeah, that's right. Susan suggested it's probably, yep, it's a typo.
It could be a typo on my account. Let me see.
Because that's because, yeah, Susan suggests that it's contagious, the word contagious, not adheres, but contagious. That makes sense. And that's different from the whole business of being testing, or which I think you're pushing it a little bit too much. It's probably much more like kind of what we say today, tried and true. So Baduku Manuse is like tried and true, something that we experience, something that is part of our empirical experience, and we can kind of extrapolate from the experience, which is in the next slide. So that would be my suggestion in terms of how to translate those. But maybe you see differently, or other people see differently. I see that Josh probably has something to say as well.
Well, I just think I am inclined to agree with Chava's reading of that as well. The Bek is in the early modern sources tends to mean to be a language of contagion of sorts. And so I think Chava's reading is very well informed.
I'll have to go back and look at whether that's whether I've switched the letters around, because that is going to change the interpretation. Thank you very much for seeing that.
Thank you. Is Michael Koso still with us, Lisa?
Here.
Hi, Michael. So since you are the scientist, the person who really knows about contagion, I'm a little bit challenged, I say, or a bit confused, especially in light of David Passig's lecture that we heard in the beginning of the session. Because in a sense, what Passig is saying in terms of the trajectory to the future is that humans will have to learn to be interdependent, because we are interdependent. We cannot live apart from, and I think your presentation last year was along the same line. So from your perspective as a scientist of pandemics, how do you understand the relationship between humans and let's say rodents? We just heard about rodents as a major carrier, or pigs. Should we live closer or more apart? What's the story here? We seem to go in two different directions at the same time.
We need to learn how to move in different directions. This is very Jewish approach. And I would pick up the terms that David Passig used, entanglement.
Entanglement, okay.
This is a very important point. And I would start from this point. We've got one small virus, right? One, and we're talking about variant. And we're talking about some bacteria. But what they calculated in our body, if we have 10 times more bacterial cells, microbial cells than our own. If we have, let's say, 70 trillions of our cells in our body, we have around 700 trillions microbial cells. And we make so big deal from only one species. And it's true, there is big difference. It's what we call pathogen or just microbe. You remember during my presentation, I made this point that at some stage it's the most critical when microbe becomes the pathogen. So we need to admit that we have we have whole world in our body, what we call microbiome. And we have whole world of microbes and viruses circulated around us. It's like ocean around us. We just cannot see them. So it's actually, we stay separately, but if we go to one room, as usually we do, we always exchange our microbes, our virus, and this is normal. So this is when I'm coming to this idea to entanglement, that we need to admit that we're not separate. I don't know if I lead in this direction that you ask, but this is what we need to, because even when they started to apply antibiotics, and now we can see how it's only limited, it's actually lead us to the dead end. So we need to admit that we have whole world in our body, we have whole world outside our body.
But we're not going to give up on antibiotics. We cannot give up on antibiotics, even though it has limitations.
I wonder if I could quickly ask a question for Susan and Josh together. I'm just curious if you ever see contagion, or in the case of your sources, Josh, or in the case of your sources about the akhbar, whatever, about mice and rats, if you ever see the language of Tuman Tahara being used to talk about contagion, especially when you're living in these very close quarters. I know David Malkiel wrote something about Tuman Tahara in the ghetto, and I'm wondering if you ever see that, like, that language ever being applied, just because it might suggest like grafting traditional models onto unprecedented events.
Susan, do you want to?
No?
Nope.
No, okay.
That was going to be my answer too.
Really? So that does that surprise you?
No.
No?
Not really.
And Jonathan, I'm just curious if you could, do you think that the Judenschau has anything to do with these elements that you're talking about? I'd just be curious to hear you talk about that.
So I think that there is something there. There's a wonderful book on the Judenschau and the role of the pig being sort of the vector of antipathy between Jewish and Christian communities, called The Glorious Beast. I think that's what it's called. It's a wonderful investigation of early modern use of the pig as a way of showing antipathy by Christians about Jews, and then conversely, Jews were using it also as a way to talk about Christian communities as well. But I don't know much more beyond that in connection with this particular vignette about about zoonotic diseases and pandemics in particular.
All right, well, thank you all very much. We are out of time, and I turn it back over to you, Chava. We had terrific discussion here. Thank you to our panelists.
Yes, thank you so much.